62-year-old native-born Oregonian, I urge you to cease going forward with your rule of permanent indoor masking.
I miss being able to communicate unimpeded, to express myself fully, and to accurately read others' facial cues.
End the mask mandate today, and before you tell me that a permanent mandate can be canceled at any time, I don't care.
Tonight, what does permanent mean? The state will tell you. It's not what you think.
I think it's pretty clear that the people simply do not trust you guys anymore.
Here's the story.
I'm Maggie Vespa. Welcome to The Story. We've been getting a ton of feedback about this one for the last day or so we're going to reiterate. This is the show where we want to hear from you. You can email thestory@kgw.com. Use the hashtag #TheStoryKGW. First up tonight, a simple message from our team. Words matter. We as broadcasters we're meticulous about which words we choose and why. So we totally get it that headlines like this one in Newsweek are freaking people out. It reads, Oregon officials propose making indoor mask mandate permanent. A permanent mandate. That's how most people would interpret that headline. And look, I'm not going to knock whoever wrote that headline, okay? But we do want you to know that if you ask the Oregon Health Authority, they'll say that headline is misleading. They'll say they don't want permanent masks in Oregon. No one does. And they'll also say they're caught between a legal rock and a hard place that amounts to either making the rule technically permanent or dropping the indoor mask mandate altogether. To explain why, let's rewind. Remember this, June 2021. Oregon Governor Kate Brown declares Oregon reopened. She shakes her fists in the air. Cases were down, vaccinations were up, and COVID restrictions lifted, including the indoor mask mandate. Fast forward to August. OPB has this headline: the Delta variant is breaking records and clobbering Oregon. That's when the OHA turned back to masks, implementing its current indoor mask mandate. Fast forward to now, and we have this new problem, or at least new situation. Under state law, temporary emergency measures like the current mandate can only last 180 days. So it's set to expire soon, specifically Tuesday, February 8th. And the OHA legally cannot implement another temporary measure. They have to drop the mandate or make it, quote, permanent. A spokesperson telling us, quote, that does not mean the rules will be in place permanently. OHA can rescind or cancel a rule when it believes it's no longer necessary. In other words, they say permanently is a technical legal term, not a practical description. But that did not do a lot to calm the long line of people, metaphorically it was on Zoom, who spoke at OHA's public hearing today. A lot of them zeroed in on the promise to cancel the rule, but they point out the OHA hasn't said when that might happen or based on what data.
No longer have any faith at OHA. End the mask mandate today, and before you tell me that a permanent mandate can be canceled at any time, I don't care.
The public doesn't trust you to end it when you say you will. Just last year, the public was told that if we reached 70% of the adult population got a COVID vaccine, the restrictions would end. Then just 3 months later, those restrictions and masking was reimposed.
The people simply do not trust you guys anymore. We don't believe that you're going to take into account the best interest of Oregonians, and we don't believe that you're going to repeal this.
Now, that meeting went on for hours, and during it, Cynthia sent us an email. She wrote, I sincerely hope that you will importantly report on the fact that there has not been a single speaker in support of this. And then she added, there are too many of us to ignore. Now, we have asked the OHA for an interview, and right now they're declining, but they do point bluntly to the state of the pandemic. And it just so happens at KGW.com, we have a brand new deep dive on COVID statistics. And it's got things like this interactive graph that shows case rates throughout the pandemic. Look at that peak on the right. Omicron has been shattering daily case records. So that means transmission is higher than ever, and good quality masks like N95s help stop that. We know that. We also know COVID fatigue is peaking as well. Case in point, a mask barbecue party in front of the Portland OHA offices. The conservative group Free Oregon staged this today, writing on their invites, the OHA votes to incinerate our rights with a permanent mask mandate. That brings us back to that word, permanent. OHA says the rule won't be permanent. In practice, they're going to repeal it. Permanent means temporary. Okay. All that said, a brief message again from our team to the OHA. We get that state law requires you to call this permanent and implement this in this manner. We also hear you when you say your intention is to cancel it at some point. So if that's truly the case, 2 years into a pandemic, when public tension is high and exhaustion is universal, can you really blame people for being confused or upset? Maybe, at the very least, it's worth finding a way to call it something else, because words matter. Okay, now to our big story. Another group who's exhausted is parents. Parents who have been watching their kids and their kids' schools suffer amid rising case rates and shrinking staff levels. So our Christine Pitawanich sat down with several parents to get their thoughts on how COVID is impacting their kids.
It's been a tough year for so many, and that definitely includes parents and families. We checked in on 6 parents who have kids spanning elementary, middle, and high school, all in the Portland metro area, to get a sense of how things are going this year.
So being back in person has been very important for my kids, both from an educational standpoint, but also a mental health and social standpoint.
For my kids, it's a complete 180 from last year. I mean, it's great. There's a lot of joy.
I mean, it's going better than last year.
It's almost been more stressful than when we were in full quarantine.
Every day they came home, it was like, oh, there was 4 fights, there were 7 fights, there was 2 fights, there was this fight.
It's like we just had to learn to be flexible.
Maya Von Geldern volunteers at a Northeast Portland public school and says she's seen firsthand the stress on teachers this year.
They are literally going across the hall back and forth, trying to teach their students and keep them on track, but also going over and covering for another class. I mean, I don't know what the quality is of learning, but kids are there. A lot of kids are not there.
Speaking of kids not being there, parents had a lot to say about some Portland schools closing due to a lack of staff during the Omicron surge.
We did this map, and if you look at the map of which schools are closed, it's very telling for which communities are being hit hardest.
The map shows Portland public schools and charter schools that have closed, marked with black X's, as well as those that have reopened, marked in blue. All of them on the east side of the city.
The way that the closures have happened this winter are like visibly inequitable. Imperfect though distance learning may have been, everyone was kind of relatively, I guess, in the same boat.
Online school does not work. Last year it did not work. It was a failure in so many regards. And it wasn't because teachers weren't trying, it's just that it doesn't work.
Eric Happel says school is the safest place for kids to be and agrees with the district priority of keeping kids learning in person at school.
It's good to see that they also then are committed to reopening them as quickly as possible.
Jennifer Dale has kids in Lake Oswego.
The policy here is we're not going to move to remote learning. So we've been pretty fortunate so far. It's a smaller district too.
Back in Portland, some parents wished there was more of a gradual transition to full-time in-person learning.
Kids just were not ready to be thrown together in the way that we threw them together.
When it comes to special education, the situation is compounded by a lack of educators and students who are having a tough time with in-person learning. Alicia Riddle has 2 kids who have special needs.
They're both on the autism spectrum.
She says one of her sons is gentle and nonverbal, but says some of his classmates are acting out.
Which means all of the support goes towards those students. And my son gets kind of, the short end of the stick.
And then there's the controversial letter sent from PPS's head of HR to teachers, alleging some teachers were encouraging colleagues to call in sick in order to close schools.
These are the people who are literally holding this together. And you got a slap on your hand as you're doing everything that you can to help keep your school moving forward. it really is a blatant slap in the face. It really is.
I mean, not to be dramatic about it, but how dare you?
I've seen what PPS is saying and the administration is saying, and I largely agree with what they've said on these topics. And I've largely disagreed with what we've heard from the union.
At the end of the day, parents tell us they want a spot at the table so they can help think up solutions.
Like even virtually Zoom something, have more like town hall kind of sessions.
Wish there was a way to be a little more creative in terms of bringing volunteers in to keep more of the schools open.
I want PPS to do something radical. I'd like to see something that's different.
Christine Pitawanich, KGW News.
So a lot of parents have told us they're afraid the pandemic and remote learning is going to set their kids back, making it harder for them to graduate, to get into college, and so on. So tonight, we actually have some data to help us judge how warranted those fears are. Ashley Korslund joins us now. So Ashley, you looked through these graduation rates all day, and there's a lot of different ways that you could kind of look at these numbers. The first thing that jumped out to us was that the graduation rates went down from 2020 to 2021.
Yeah, they did, by 2% to be exact, which could show you the toll that remote learning has taken on students' education. But then if you look at it this way, on the other hand, the graduation rate from last year was actually higher than many pre-pandemic school years. So let's show you the numbers. The state's graduation rate for 2021 was 80%. Education leaders want to point out that this is the second highest rate since the state started keeping track. But there's another part of this story. So last year, Oregon loosened some of the requirements to graduate across the state, and that was in response to the pandemic. It got rid of what's called the Essential Skills Assessment requirement, and that's where students had to pretty much demonstrate their skills in reading, writing, and math. So I asked the director of the Oregon Department of Education if that had any impact on the graduation rates, and he said no.
So do you feel students are actually performing better, or do you think the graduation rate is higher because people would argue the standards were lowered during the pandemic?
Yeah, I would strongly argue that our students are reaching very high and rigorous standards. So Oregon did not change any of its credit requirements for earning a diploma. Oregon requires 24 credits. We require some of the more rigorous math credits around the state. There are only around the country. There are only 2 states that require more credits to graduate from high school than Oregon. That's our requirements were highly rigorous, and I don't think our students' rates were increased because of any change there.
Now, something else we found in the data that students of color and those experiencing homelessness saw drops in graduation rates last year. So Maggie, officials say there's still work to be done to help some of these marginalized communities.
Yeah, unfortunately, that makes sense. So we should point out that Oregon's been working for years to bring these numbers up. Our graduation rates are still among the worst in the country. So what's the plan now with this information?
Yeah, so the Oregon Department of Education, ODE, is currently looking at how equitable the state's current graduation requirements really are, if they're fair for all students in Oregon. So what ODE is telling me is it will give its recommendations to the legislature this next September, and then lawmakers will take it from there. And Maggie, we'll see if they make any permanent changes with really the requirements to graduate in Oregon.
Yeah, of course, we'll be watching. Ashley, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Searching for a COVID test because your pharmacy is out of stock? People in Washington are trying to get them off Craigslist, where some tests are selling for up to $90. The reason? The state does not have a law against price gouging.
I was shocked to find out that we were among just a handful of states that did not have any kind of protections for people in the event of an emergency.
When the story continues.
Just reading some emails off camera. We have a lot of people writing in saying they're in favor of OHA making the mask mandate permanent because they know permanent means temporary. So write in, send us your take on that story or any of these stories. You can email the story at kgw.com or use our hashtag, the story KGW. On to the next, though. COVID tests are probably the most in-demand item right now, and good luck finding them over the counter at a pharmacy. Unfortunately, we know high demand and low supply leads to price gouging. Now, Oregon has a law protecting against that, but Washington does not. And because of that, Ted Land with our sister station in Seattle found COVID tests on Craigslist going for way more money than you can get them at a store.
Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson says his office responded to 1,300 complaints about price gouging of products like hand sanitizer and masks last year. Now, with COVID tests sold out pretty much everywhere, the state wants people to report sellers taking advantage of the shortage to jack up prices of at-home kits. A quick search on Craigslist reveals a secondhand market charging $60 to $90 for tests that cost about $15 in stores. The Attorney General's office says businesses that raise prices on emergency goods in order to maximize profit during an emergency commit an unfair business practice, a violation of the Washington Consumer Protection Act. The state does not have a price gouging law, though last year the Attorney General tried to get the legislature to pass one.
I was just absolutely shocked at my lack of understanding about what had been happening for those first 2 weeks of the pandemic. And so in looking at what protections we had in the state of Washington, I was shocked to find out that we were among just a handful of states that did not have any kind of protections for people in the event of an emergency, something that they could not control.
The measure failed after opposition from business groups. While people scramble to find tests, state and federal officials are asking for patience, promising more are coming. The federal government just launched a website where you can sign up to have 4 free kits mailed to your home. Washington is starting its own portal where people can order 4 to 5 free tests per household. They're expecting very high demand.
Some of us are going to get that message that says we're out of tests when we go to order. And we really do encourage people to be patient and come back in a few days and see if there is more supply.
That was Ted Land reporting. Now, we should point out Washington's free test portal website isn't up yet, but the state says it should launch over the weekend, if not by Friday, by tomorrow. Once you place an order, it'll take a week or 2 for those tests to arrive. And we also asked the Oregon Health Authority if they're planning to set up a free test portal like this, and their response was, not at this time. They previously said they do not have the capacity to individually send out tests, but they are distributing millions of free tests to local health centers, schools, shelters, and community organizations this month. All right, let's switch gears and get to this question from Ryan. He wrote, it would be great to get an update on how those unarmed park rangers are doing. Ryan, great point. You might remember last year, of course Ryan does, the city of Portland passed a big $6 million package to tackle the gun violence epidemic. Instead of police, the money went to community groups. It went toward hiring more park rangers who are, yes, unarmed. So we checked in with Portland Parks and Rec, and they told us they've been able to hire 17 new park rangers and 2 new supervisors with that funding. They've still got 7 more spots to fill, they add, and the next round of hires will hopefully happen early this year. Now, whether or not these park rangers are having an impact on the city's gun violence epidemic, that's a harder question to answer. According to the Oregonian, only about 3% of shootings in Portland actually happen in city parks, which is where park rangers obviously have jurisdiction. And Parks and Rec also sent us this statement saying, quote, park rangers are not replacements for police. They work with the Portland Police Bureau to problem solve issues in parks that are beyond the scope of park rule violations. For example, criminal activity, weapons, threats, and other issues that a person would typically call 911 for are still referred to police. So that would, of course, include gun violence. Now, last night we told you how we discovered the federal government was auctioning off masks and including the VA in Roseburg. Well, tonight we finally got an explanation from the VA when the story continues. If you missed it last night, we spent a lot of time talking about masks and an example of what seems like government waste. Investigative reporter Kyle Boshi found the federal government is trying to get rid of more than 1 million new unexpired masks by putting them up for government surplus auction. He found more than a dozen separate listings in the past month for masks on a government website that auctions off extra unused supplies. It's not clear why the U.S. government is looking to unload the N95 and K95 masks. Most are still in cardboard boxes. They're shrink wrapped. They're stored on pallets. They all appeared to come from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. After our story, we heard from you, including from a veteran named Kevin. He emailed and said, "I found your story very misleading. You never gave the VA side of the story." So let's bring in Kyle Boshi. Kyle, what is the VA side of the story?
All right, well, first, we appreciate the feedback. And to be clear, we reached out to the VA several times in advance of our story for a response. We didn't hear back until this morning after our story aired. A spokesperson sent me an email answering our questions. Among them, why are these masks being sold? The VA explained it's up to local medical centers to evaluate inventory and to determine current and future needs. They also need to look at how much storage they've got. Here's a quote. "The decision to dispose of excess material balances the purchase cost, storage, and inventory management cost and risk of product expiration against the current and projected clinical needs." That's from a VA spokesperson named Randall Noller. He went on to explain how the VA tries to recover some of the purchase costs by auctioning off these masks.
Gotcha. But again, can't they use these masks like somewhere else? I mean, we heard from a government watchdog group in your original story asking that very question.
Why isn't the Veterans Affairs turning to other offices? I mean, if one office can't use them, I'm pretty sure that some others may. There may be some local government offices that could use those, federal, state, and government offices that can use those masks.
Just a quick refresher there. So we know, obviously, there's a demand for masks. If they're not using them, why doesn't the VA just give them away to the public or to, like that source said, other government offices?
It's a very good question. The VA didn't answer that directly, but did say it offers the masks to other federal and state agencies along with the public, again, through a surplus auction or to the highest bidder.
Gotcha. And these aren't, by the way, just to reiterate, old or expired masks, right? Like there's nothing wrong with these masks.
No, they're really in good condition, and they're good masks, N95 and KN95. We actually went to the VA in Roseburg to inspect them before one of the auctions closed. The masks we looked at, they were new white KN95s. They were wrapped in a plastic bag and then packed in a cardboard box. They were not expired, had plenty of shelf life. Again, nationwide, we're talking about more than 1 million high-quality masks that the federal government is trying to unload at government surplus auctions.
All right. Really appreciate the update and answering that viewer's question. Kyle, thank you so much. Okay, keep sending your questions and your comments to the story at kgw.com. We're going to finish the show next. This week's Hey Help cause, Brown Hope. They help Black, Brown, and Indigenous Portlanders through what they call a healing justice framework. And that work comes in many forms, like direct cash assistance to meet basic financial needs and creating community spaces for neighbors to support each other. Here's Chief Healing Officer Cameron Witten.
In the past 2 years during COVID-19, Brown Hope has organized to ensure that communities disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and systemic racism have had the opportunity for a more resilient future. In those last 2 years, since 2020, we have responded to urgent community needs and served over 10,000 Black, Brown, and Indigenous Portlanders through economic empowerment, community building, education advocacy, mental and emotional health, and direct community aid.
If you want to donate, hold your phone's camera up to the QR code on your screen. You can also go to kgw.com/heyhelp. And while you're holding your phone, and who isn't, frankly, just follow us on Twitter at @TheStoryKGW or email thestory@kgw.com. That does it for this show. Laurel Porter is standing by with the news at 6:30.
This is KGW News at 6:30.
Good evening, everyone. We begin here at 6:30 with the pandemic and a concerning figure in Oregon. There are now more than 1,000